Hello and welcome to Bandwidth Conversations, a podcast that finds out about the stories and journeys of artists, performers and rock stars of life. I am Katie Brewer and today's conversation is thanks to New College, Oxford, where I was a student. I feel very fortunate to be having a series of conversations with fellow alumni, and my guest today is a playwright, screenwriter, translator, adaptor, director and lyricist. At the age of 20, in his second year at New College, he made the theatrical history books as the youngest playwright in the modern era to have a production in the West End. He is perhaps best known for his play Les Liaisons dangereuses, based on the novel of the same name and the film adaptation. He has twice received the Academy Award for Best Adapted Screenplay for Dangerous Liaisons in 1988 and The Father in 2020, and was nominated for Atonement in 2007. He is also known for his work in the theatre, including When Did You Last Meet My Mother, Total Eclipse and The Philanthropist. He has translated many plays, such as Chekhov's The Seagull, Ibsen's Hedda Gabler, Yasmina Reza's The God of Carnage, Florian Zeller's The Height of the Storm. He wrote the books and lyrics for the musical Sunset Boulevard and received 2 Tony Awards for Book of a Musical and Best Original Score. When I looked at all he had done, I felt completely overwhelmed. I thought, I can't do this. It's too difficult. He's done too much. I don't know where to start. But I managed to get over that quite quickly, as what a treat it is for me to have the chance to talk today to Sir Christopher Hampton. So, Christopher, thank you so much for being here.
Oh, it's a pleasure, Katie. It's a pleasure.
Well, you were born in the Azores, and then you moved to Aden in Yemen, and then Alexandria in Egypt, which I think I'm right in saying was the place that felt most like home to you. Could you describe your time there?
I think I got there when I was about 5, and there was a bit of a flurry when we first arrived because there was something called the Egyptian Revolution, so we'd hardly arrived before we were evacuated. But then we went back and were there until 1956, when, of course, there was a real conniption, which was the Suez invasion. At that time, we had to leave Egypt for good, but it's places in your childhood that you think of as sort of lost paradise, really. And I just was very, very happy for 5 years in Egypt. And Alexandria was one of the great sort of cosmopolitan Mediterranean cities. It had, population of all kinds of nationalities. And so it was quite a good sort of training to be a citizen of the world.
So I actually read your autobiographical play, White Chameleon, just yesterday, in fact. And the first time when you were sent back to Britain, you went to a school in Plymouth, and I grew up in Plymouth, and I thought, oh, Plymouth. And then I read the scene and I thought, oh, Plymouth. You were sort of vilified on the one hand by being British in Egypt and then by coming back to having lived in Egypt. So I would imagine that was tricky times.
Well, it's good training there, good training for a writer, to be branded an outsider in 2 different places.
You formed a close friendship or bond with your servant, Ibrahim. Did you ever find out what happened to him when you left?
I did. I went back eventually, actually with a designer, Bob Crowley, but when we were doing the play in 1991. Prior to that, I went back with Bob to just take him around and show him the places where I'd grown up. We weren't allowed into the house that I'd lived in because it was now a girls' school, but there was a little sort of side alley next to the house, and I took Bob around there and I said, I used to come here every morning on my way to the tram station and pick up a bag of eucalyptus sweets, at which point a man came out of this hole in the wall, looked across the street at me and said, Christopher. And I hadn't seen him for 35 years.
Oh my goodness, he was still there.
And no, this was the guy who ran the shop, so he knew everything. So he knew what had happened to our neighbours, he knew. And I asked him about Ibrahim, and he said, oh, he was a Libyan. Well, of course, I suppose as a child, you never crossed your mind to ask that sort of question. So I didn't know. I hadn't known that he was a Libyan. He said after the Suez crisis, he had 2 wives, and I always say 10 children, but I don't know, he had a lot of children. And he took them all back to Libya. So I hope he was all right there. I never heard from him again. And my father tried to find out about him, but wasn't able to.
At what stage did you find that you had these sort of creative urges? Because your family was quite sporty.
Yes, they were all on tennis and yachting and water polo, God knows what all. And I was the sort of little boy with thick spectacles in the corner reading a book, of which there weren't many in the house. So I don't know where it came from. I have no idea. But at this school I was at in Alexandria, which was rather mistakenly called the British Boys' School. There were about 4 British boys at the school. We had 2 lessons a week in what was called drama, and the teacher, who was English, we were all encouraged to write plays and then put them on in the classroom.
So that would have been at the age of about 8 or 9.
Yeah, yeah. So I had fun doing that, and continued doing it when I came back to when I was parked off in the prep school in the boarding school in England. I kept on with it, and we used to, do these plays at the end of term and so on. So I was sort of in the habit of writing plays in a casual sort of way. That turned out, what I most enjoyed doing until I was doing it professional, when it became rather stressful.
And so you went from your prep school to Lancing. And at what stage, having had this extraordinary experience in Alexandria, did you find life in the UK or school in the UK palatable?
Well, I think Lancing was a very, very lucky break for me. I happened to get a prize in Greek at my prep school because I'd studied it in Alexandria, where most people spoke Greek. The headmaster of Lancing came to give the prizes away and said to me afterwards, "It's very interesting. You got a prize in Greek. Would you like to go to Lancing?" And I said, "Oh, yes, sir," having no idea what Lancing meant. And then I spoke to my father, who said, "Well, if you can get a scholarship, we might be able to afford the fare,
The rest."
the fees." And luckily I did. So that's how I got to Lancing, to find it with this reforming headmaster who was called John Dancy, who had just arrived. He was undergoing a sort of tremendous liberalisation. All the sort of brutal old public school habits were being got rid of slowly. You didn't, sport was no longer compulsory. You didn't have to go to chapel if you didn't want to. You were allowed to put on plays and write. You were encouraged to follow artistic pursuits if that's what you preferred doing. So the school, in fact, produced a lot of musicians and writers. David Hare was there at the same time as I was, and so was Tim Rice, who both of whom I've continued my friendships with throughout life. And so we all sort of emerged from Lancing about the same time.
Yes, it was a very talented cohort there. And Victor Henry was there as well, wasn't he, at the same?
No, Victor was a working class boy from Yorkshire.
Oh, was he?
He was an actor who played in my first 2 plays, and we sadly lost him when he was young. He died when he was in his 30s, but he was just a fantastic actor. No, the thing about Victor really was very important in my life, because he proved to me that it wasn't a good idea to be an actor. In other words, that was what I'd always wanted to do. I played the part in my first play at Oxford, and then when it was done in London, and I thought, when I first met Victor, he was quite unsuitable for the part and wouldn't be very good. Then I saw him do it, and I thought, oh, I see, that's what acting is. I better steer away from that and keep on with the writing, because he was such a remarkable actor, and died. He was hit by a hit-and-run driver, in the 70s.
Gosh. Oh, well, that's so interesting, because I never realised that actually you were an aspiring actor at the time. You wrote a novel, didn't you, when you were at school, and you wrote a play as well. What was your novel about?
School.
It was about, well, write what you know. And what came of it?
Oh, I sent it to lots of publishers, and I guess it wasn't very good. I had lots of polite refusals. I remember having one refusal from a publisher called Anthony Blonde, who said, "You're very young. There's plenty of time for you to do something useful." It was rather gratifying 10 years later to receive a letter from Anthony Blonde himself saying, "If you ever feel like writing a novel."
Were you able to say to him, "Well, I did actually, and shame on you, you didn't take it"?
I can't remember whether I said what I answered, but in any case, I'm sure they were right. It was because the novel had been rejected that I kind of thought about it, and I thought, well, actually, the best bits are the dialogue bits. So just with the sort of arrogance or ignorance of youth, I just thought, well, I'll write a play. And that was my first play, which I wrote between school, in what is now called the gap year.
Yes, you applied to Oxford. In fact, am I right in saying your French tutor, Harry Guest, and he's also a poet, he was at Lancing. In an article I read, he is quoted as saying that you were quite simply one of the most brilliant students he'd ever taught. But you applied to Oxford. Why New College?
Well, again, it was one of those kind of chance things. Harry Guest persuaded me to study French and German instead of English, which was a marvelous decision. One of the best decisions of my life, really. He just said, "You'll read all those books you'd read in the English course anyway, so this will open up 2 whole new literatures to you." And he knew a man called Merlin Thomas, who was the French tutor at New College, and indeed I met him because he came down to Lansing to judge something that is sort of hard to imagine schools doing this sort of thing these days, but they had a French-speaking prize. So you had to learn a poem and then you performed it, and then but somebody came down and judged. So the Merlin was there, and the belief, which I'm sure had no grounding in fact, was just a prejudice, was that if you read English, you should go to Cambridge. And if you read languages, Oxford was the better place to go. So that was, what did I know? I just sat the exam and went and did the interview and got the place. And that, again, was a piece of enormous luck because Merlin was on the board of the Oxford University Dramatic Society and was very, very sympathetic loved the theatre, was very sympathetic to anything like that. And John Cowan, who was my German tutor, had lots of connections in the theatrical world in Germany. So first of all, Merlin was extremely tolerant of the fact that I was never handing in my essays on time. I was always in London at rehearsals, And John, I knew I was going to have to take a year off because it was my second year that all this happened with the play. So I knew I'd have to take a year off. And John Cowan arranged for me to go and get a job at the big theatre, the Hamburg Schauspielhaus in Hamburg, where I didn't last very long because there was sort of a revolution in the theatre and everybody got fired, including the people who weren't being paid like me.
No.
So I made my way, mostly by thumb, to Paris and stayed there the rest of the year and wrote another play. And so consequently, my French is better than my German.
And was that play Total Eclipse, the one that you wrote in Paris?
Yeah.
And could we go back to, because I think it's just so extraordinary how you have this play, When Did You Last See My Mother? It's handwritten in a book. And how does it go from that to being a West End hit?
I mean, I wrote it, as I say, I wrote it when I was 18, I guess, and then came up to New College and was involved in my first year there. And at the end of the first year, ALDS had a competition. They said they would put on plays by undergraduates, so they were inviting submissions. So I gave the play, which was actually written on sort of loose paper and handwritten, mostly in pubs, if I remember rightly. I gave this to Merlin to read and said, what do you think? Is it worth entering this competition? What's your advice? So he read it and he said, my first advice is to type it out. So I did. And again, we were lucky because there were supposed to be two plays and the other one got cancelled because of some very unlikely thing. I think the leading man got measles or something. Really unlikely. And so the undergraduate play competition turned out to be When Did You Last See My Mother? And in those days, you do something like that and a journalist would turn up. So this guy turned up from the Oxford Mail and wrote a very good review. That was it.
How did that go from the good review to having an agent?
Well, I had lots of offers from agents. And again, I didn't know what to do. So I consulted Merlin and he arranged for me to meet a woman called Elizabeth Sweeting, who was the administrator of the Oxford Playhouse, who was a very nice woman. And she said to me, look, there's only really one tremendously influential agent for playwrights, and that's Margaret Ramsay, Peggy Ramsay. Send it to her. So I did. And about 2 weeks later, I had a ground floor room in the main quad in New College, and I was sitting in the window, and one of the bulldogs came over and said, you're wanted on the phone. So I hurried. It was sheer force of personality that Peggy had bullied this fellow into. And she said, well, come to London tomorrow. And I said, well, I don't know if I can. I've got these lectures and so on. She said, never mind all that. Come to London and we'll talk. So the next day I did. I went and met her. And pretty much while I was there, she rang up the Royal Court, rang up William Gaskell, who was the director at the Royal Court, and said, we've got this very interesting play. I think you should read it. And, when you've read it, I expect you'll want to put it on. And
how did you cope with this? Because you're sort of catapulted into fame, interest, praise, busyness. How did you handle it all?
Well, it was all very sort of whirlwind. It was all very bewildering. And then the play did so well. It was really only put on for 2 performances on a Sunday night. They were called Productions Without Decor at the Royal Court.
And was it the same actors that had done it at Oxford?
No, because I'd done it at Oxford and Victor.
Oh, that's when Victor Henry did it. Okay.
It was really an astonishing performance. And, the reviews all said, well, this is the most exciting actor since Albert Finney or Nicol Williamson or whatever. So the attention was very much focused on his performance, quite rightly at that point. Then we got an offer to transfer the play to the West End, which had never happened with one of these Sunday night shows before. So that was very exciting. So my play had been on in Josca's Little Theatre in Headington in February. And here we were in June in the West End. The next year, which was my year abroad, kind of cooled all that down a bit. So I got used to the idea of what I wanted to do with my life, whether I really wanted to devote my life to being a professional writer.
Was that the year that you were given an extra year? Most modern language students have a year abroad anyway.
No, that was the year abroad. It was less common, I think. I mean, maybe it's more common now, but certainly my exact contemporary at Oxford, New College, who was my great friend Neil McGregor, who you should probably talk to, he chose to not have a year away. The disadvantage of taking this year away was when you got back to Oxford the next year, as it were, your fourth year, all your contemporaries had sort of graduated. So it was like kind of coming back to a whole new gang of people. Merlin arranged for me to live in somewhere called the Maison Française, which was brand new. It was just opening, which took 8 students who were studying French. And that was very, very interesting too, because the Maison Française was where visiting French important people came to Oxford. That's where they stayed. So you got to have, as a student there, I got to have dinner with Jean Renoir and Marcel Marceau and Michel Butor, the novelist, and lots of really interesting people who were passing through Oxford. Yeah, so New College looked after me very, very well.
As you reflect back on New College, what would you say is your most treasured memory?
What I remember best is the sort of conversations. And it always seemed to be, the weather always seemed to be quite good. I mean, this is this distortion of memory. So I remember kind of lounging about in gardens and, often with a drink and talking to people about life, really. And it was a very optimistic time. It was the mid-60s, mid to late 60s. And really, it looked like the world was fixing to change, which unfortunately subsequently didn't. But so there was a great feeling of optimism in the air. That's really my most vivid memory of Oxford.
You managed to get a first-class degree as well. So how you quite managed to do that with everything else that was going on, that's pretty extraordinary.
It did breed one very bad habit, which was I always, all through my life, I've never quite recovered from the fact I learned at Oxford to do everything at the last minute. Been a sort of 50-year scramble ever since.
And then straight after, because you write Total Eclipse in your third year, but you don't put that on until you're at the Royal Court. Is that right?
You're absolutely right. But they weren't at all sure they wanted to do it when they read it. It was kind of different from the first play. And there was a marvellous afternoon at Maison Française where William Gaskell and Robert Kidd, who was the young Scottish director who did all my first few plays, came up to Oxford and asked me to read it to them. So I found myself, it was quite a small room with a kind of weird modern chair in the corner with a split in it, which Bill took, and a kind of straight back chair, which Bob took. And I sort of lay on the bed and read the play. Bill Gaskell specialised in long and disarming and frightening pauses. So it was an enormous pause. And then he said, okay, all right, we'll do it. And more than that, they actually then gave me a job so that I went straight from Oxford to the Royal Court to work in the literary department, and more or less went straight from, I think, you graduate in June or whatever it is, and the play started rehearsals in August. So, it was a pretty seamless transition, yeah.
When I saw the film with Leonardo DiCaprio, who does, I think, such an amazing job of being sort of ruthless and destructive in one moment and then incredibly vulnerable in the next. And that film happened how much later than the play?
It was almost, not quite, sort of 15 or 16 years, nearly 20 years later. The thing was that when the play was first done, it was very, very viciously received by the critics, very badly received, for all sorts of reasons, partly because if they sort of feel they've slightly overpraised you the first time out, they'll do the opposite the second time. So it was confusing because I knew it was a better play than the first play, but it didn't seem to land at all. But a lot of people who saw it really remembered the production and the performances, especially Victor. And in 1981, I think, so 13 years later, it was revived. David Hare directed it, and Simon Callow and Hilton McRae were in it. And it was far better received the second time. And then the process of going towards a film was very protracted, as is often the case. River Phoenix was going to be in it, but unfortunately died that year.
Gosh.
And this boy, Leonardo DiCaprio, who was then 19, and Agnieszka Holland, who was directing the film, said he's very, very good. And I watched What's Eating Gilbert Grape, and I thought, gosh, he is very good. And, I was on the set quite a bit. He was wonderful to watch because it's so unusual to see an actor who does 5 takes and does 5 completely different things. The problem you have as a director is which one you're going to choose, because they're all quite good. So I was really impressed by him, and he hasn't done badly.
He hasn't. Having had this extraordinary response to your first play, for some people that will give them enormous confidence. And then on the other hand, it can really pile on the pressure. How did you cope?
Well, as I say, it was quite confusing to have this play so sort of slaughtered, really. But luckily, one of the things that Peggy Ramsey had said to me very early on is if you're going to have a career writing plays, there's 2 ways you can go. You can either create a kind of style and write as essentially the same play or variations of the same play over and over again. And that's a choice that is a lot of people take, quite prudent, I think. She said, or you can just try and do something completely different every single time, which appealed to me much more. So I thought after Total Eclipse, I would try a kind of formal comedy, which was The Philanthropist, which was sort of infused with a lot of memories of Oxford, which turned out to be, again, there was a lot of dithering and delay, and they almost didn't do it at the Royal Court because it didn't sort of feel much like a Royal Court play at the time.
And what was a Royal Court play?
It's a very interesting question. I mean, Bill Gaskell was asked it in an interview, and he said any play not written by Tom Stoppard, which was a very mean thing to say, but it was to do with the fact that the Royal Court was embattled, and Bill had almost gone to jail because he put on these 2 Edward Bond plays, which had been banned. And so they were used to fighting these battles, and they didn't care for big success, so that they were immediately suspicious of writers who had great success in the commercial theatre. So, of course, the Philanthropist fell very much into that category, and they kind of sensed that in advance. But then its success did a great many things. I mean, I felt kind of sheepish about it. I left the Royal Court in 1970, just after it opened, but it paid for the Royal Court's air conditioning. I think it earned the Royal Court more money than any previous play. And it set up the basis for my being able to operate as a freelance writer, which hadn't really been on the cards until then. I think of it very affectionately.
Well, it's fantastic. Amazing, amazing play. And then not only do you not have the same genre for your plays, but you then turn your hand to writing film. And did that come straight away after your spell at the Royal Court?
It was during the first screenplay I wrote was this, because I sold the film rights of When Did You Last See My Mother to Richard Attenborough and Brian Forbes, who had a company. And they hired me to write the screenplay. Marvelous, because this check for the film rights arrived on my 21st birthday, and I took all my Oxford friends out to dinner. Blew most of it. The bad news was that I had no idea how to write a film script. I had never read a film script. It's actually very, very different. And the only thing I could think of to do is I bought this book, which was called 5 Screenplays by Harold Pinter. And the books they were all adaptations of novels. I bought the novels that they were based on and saw how it was done. That was my film school. But then I wrote a very poor script. I mean, I really, I'm sure it was. I haven't looked at it, but about 40 years later, I got an envelope containing a lot of sort of yellowing scraps of paper. It was a charming letter from Richard Attenborough saying, I think we can give you back the rights of this. Anyway, it was, I really wanted to write films, whereas as a child, I'd hardly ever been to the theatre. My dad was crazy about the films, and we used to go 2 or 3 times a week in Alexandria. My education, my drama education, was watching, American films of the 50s. Whereas, for some reason, playwriting had come relatively naturally to me. It took me a long time to work out the differences in film. And eventually, I think after 10 years of writing plays, and all of them being at the Royal Court, I decided to take a year off and really, really try to work out how to write a film. I did take a year off, and I wrote a film called Carrington.
Yes, which I saw recently. Beautiful film about Dora Carrington and Lytton Strachey, and you directed it as well as wrote it.
I did. It took 18 years from that first year that I wrote it to actually getting it in front of the camera. There is this famous thing in film called development hell, and, everybody goes through it. And Carrington started as a commission from Warner Brothers because in the mid-70s, English stuff was very fashionable. So I had lunch with some bloke from Warner Brothers and had just read Michael Holroyd's book on Lit and Straight Sheet and pitched him this story and got hired. So that was originally a Hollywood film, which they quite rightly, first of all, after a year, everyone had forgotten that they'd asked me in the first place. And when they read it, I think they were completely bewildered. So they were never going to do it. So it took a long time.
How did it come about in the end?
Well, there were various failed versions. Funnily enough, there's a young American producer at the time, was called Ronnie Shedlow, and he had bought the rights. He was the one who had bought the rights for When Did You Last See My Mother. He'd become a friend of mine. By this time, I had an office separate from where my family lived, and he used to stay there when he was coming to London for one reason or another. And he was an insomniac, so one night he was prowling around the office and he found the script. He then devoted, 7 or 8 years to putting the money together slowly and from various sources. And this often happens. The money was very, 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 very slowly coming together, and everything was looking good, and then suddenly Dutch Polygram, which was a record company, somebody read the script there and said, okay, we'll give you all the money for it, just like that. So we had to then contact all these people who were putting up 200,000 or 300,000 here and there and say, thank you very much, we've got all the money. And then there was a drama about the director, and it wound up eventually being me. And I really, really enjoyed doing it. In a way, of all the things I've done, it's the thing I feel most proud of.
Well, I remember Emma Thompson saying how relaxed everything was on set as a result of, and it was your first time you directed something, I think.
She wasn't inside my head.
No. Well, obviously you did a really good job of hiding it, which is where your acting skills come in. But it's a fantastic cast. And yes, and that whole sort of quintessential English, it would have been really tough to have an American team doing that, I think, because they wouldn't understand that.
Again, we were very lucky. We had this marvelous summer. So day after day were these beautiful summer days. And it is, if you have a long career, it is very strange how much of it is governed by luck. And sometimes you have a ration of good luck and a ration of bad luck, and it hopefully come out somewhere in the middle. But it was very lucky that we got that film made, just as it was incredibly lucky that we managed to get Dangerous Liaison made in the face of a sort of rival version that was gearing up to go, directed by Milos Forman.
How did that come about? Because you found this novel, didn't you, when you were at Oxford?
Merlin Thomas used to make us do history prelims.
History prelims?
Yes, which were in one term rather than languages prelims, which were in 2 terms. So if you did your history prelims and you scraped through them, and then you had a whole second term free to decide to read, which of course most of us hadn't done before, to read and decide which period you wanted to study. And the 18th century book was Les Liaisons dangereuses. So I read it in my first year at Oxford. I thought it was the greatest novel I'd ever read.
Did you think at that moment that
no, I didn't. But I didn't actually. I don't know, not till the 70s. It dawned on me that it might make a play. But it was very difficult to get anyone to do it because they would read the book and say, well, it's just letters, and they never meet each other. It's an epistolary novel, and the 2 main characters just write to each other. So obviously it was a challenge. I would have been demoralized, but it was one of Peggy Ramsey's absolute. She kept on and on at me. She said, this is really going to make a good play. And eventually I got an open commission from the Royal Shakespeare Company, where I'd never worked before, and just did, without telling them what I was doing, I did Liaison and handed it in. And they weren't best pleased, as I remember. But anyway, so they scheduled it for like 23 performances in what was called the Upper Place, and then it just took off. So it got out of their control. They were always baffled by its success, I think.
And that was Alan Rickman, wasn't it? And who played Valmont?
Yes, my wife Laura is a great casting director, and
oh, is she?
She said, "What about this guy?" Because I think the Barchester Chronicles, the Trollop, had just been on television,
okay.
And so that was great. And then Lindsay Duncan and Juliet Stevenson were already in the company, and so was Leslie Manville and Fiona Shaw. So we had all of those marvelous actors, and Hilton McRae, and they left us alone. We had, you have a long rehearsal period at those national theatres because the actors are always involved in several productions at once. And slowly over that summer, we all started to think, this is something, we've got something really good here.
How long did it take for that to translate into the film?
Well, again, Peggy Ramsey played a big part in this. It's the only time it's ever happened to me. We got offers from every single major studio for the film rights. She said, "If I were you, dear, I'd wait till it was on Broadway because the offers will be better." So I think, well, yeah, but suppose Broadway's really one thing or the other. In other words, if you get a bad review in the New York Times, you're finished. So I said, well, isn't it a bit of a risk? And she said, yes, but let's gamble. So then we got a very good review in the New York Times the next day. And I was able to do what I hadn't previously been able to do, which was to say, if I sell you the film rights, will you let me be an associate producer so I could help with, keep an eye on them, be there while they were shooting.
Yes, because that must be incredibly hard, that it's your baby and you've been with it all the way, and to give it to somebody else who could do anything with it must be extraordinarily difficult.
Well, that's where the luck came, because, of course, the instinct of the studio was to give it to every fancy director they could think of. So I met lots and lots of directors, good directors. I'd always wanted to do it with Stephen Frears because I'd worked with him on television in the 70s. And I liked him very much. And I thought a rather sort of scruffy approach would be better for the material than some tremendously expensive period picture. He really was known as a television director at that point, and it was very hard to get the studio to focus on him. When Milos had announced that he was going to make a film, when all the potential directors melted away because they were frightened of Milos, and the company, Lorimar, made the irrational decision to go ahead with the film because they were in bad financial trouble. And Bernie Brillstein, who ran the company, said, well, if we're going down the tubes, what difference does it make? And so I got them to take Stephen because they were panicking, because I promised them that if we got Stephen, we could get the film out before Milos. So we started shooting. I gave Stephen the script in sort of January, and then we started shooting in May, and we were in the cinema before Christmas.
Wow, that must be one of the quickest turnarounds in the history of such an extraordinary film.
Well, in a way, we didn't have the same sort of worries around it, but it was pretty much the same with The Father. If you get a group of people who know what they're doing and just let them get on with it. But this so seldom happens there's so many egos and so much money involved in films that somebody or other will try and put their oar in and lose the focus of the original, the sort of drive. It's very perilous making a film. And the result is that, and this is what I always say to screenwriting students, is if you get a score of 1 out of 3 films made, you're doing very well, which is roughly I've had about 20 films made and I've written about 60 scripts. So, and then it's not to do with whether they're good or not. It's to do with
how the wind blows.
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, of course, Dangerous Liaisons received 7 Oscar nominations. Were you surprised?
Yes, we were, because the film opened the week before Christmas. So it got in under the radar. Didn't get any Golden Globe because I think it was opened too late for the Golden Globes, or anyway. And it so happened that Stephen Frears and Norma Heyman, who was our producer, and I were all having lunch in a restaurant in Notting Hill. And somebody arrived from, I think, Channel 4 News and said, all these nominations were, so we were all sort of slightly bewildered with our mouths full, Oscars was wonderful, but it wasn't such a big deal in those days. There wasn't all that campaigning and carry on. So all of us, I think we went out to Los Angeles on like the Thursday or something, and then the Oscars were on the Sunday, and then we all went home again. With Atonement, which was, I guess, nearly 20 years later, it was explained to me that in September you have to start going around and doing interviews all over America and having lunch with people and campaigning. And Tim Bevan, who was the producer, I said, do I really have to do all this? And he said, yeah, I'm afraid so. It's in the contract. And then he said, sad thing is we're not going to win any of them. And indeed, we also had 7 nominations for Atonement, but Dario Marianelli, who was the composer, was the only one who won. But we'd done all this massive amount of campaigning.
And why did he think you weren't going to win?
Because he was also the producer of the Coen brothers film, No Country for Old Men, which everybody knew was their moment had come. And I remember the night of the Oscars, sitting with a friend of mine who no longer with us, Ronald Harwood, a playwright, who had been nominated for his script for a film called The Diving Bell and the Butterfly. And the ceremony was about to start, and he was sitting next to me, and we were in like row M. And he said, It's a strange thing. He said, I'm suddenly beginning to feel very optimistic. I said, Ronnie, can you see where the Coen brothers are sitting?
Brilliant. I recently rewatched Atonement, and having read the Ian McEwan novel and watched it several times now, I always have this hope that it's going to end differently. There's going to be a happy ending to it. When you're adapting novels or plays, do you always stick very, very closely to the original, or can you use a bit of poetic license?
It honestly varies, and I learned a lot again from reading those Harold Pinter scripts that there were some scripts he like the Go-Between, where he kept very, very close to the book, and other scripts. There was a book called The Quiller Memorandum, where he kind of had fun and made things up and changed things. So it varies. You have to make a judgment. I'm hoping to work. I think it's just been announced actually, but I'm hoping to work with Stephen Frears again later on, because I've done an adaptation of a book called Mr. Wilder and Me by Jonathan Coe about Billy Wilder. In that case, I mean, I read the book and loved it, but I contacted Jonathan Coe, who I knew very slightly, and said, look, do you mind if I do rather a loose adaptation, because it's quite hard to get. I mean, I can see the way to do a narrative, and it doesn't necessarily. It will involve changes from your novel. Is that all right? And he said yes. And then I did it, and then he luckily liked it very much. So, but it's a delicate business, and with Atonement, I mean, the more work we did, Joe Wright and I, on it, the closer we kept going closer and closer back to the original, because it's such a great novel. And as with the Billy Wilder novel, it was really my initiative. That's to say, I read Atonement and I then lobbied for the job, because in that case, I needed to go and audition for Ian McEwan, but luckily he took me.
Well, it's an extraordinary film, as is The Father, with Anthony Hopkins as the octogenarian who is suffering from Alzheimer's. And I think it is so incredibly powerful and frightening to be inside his head and seeing these people that are telling him they're his relatives and he's no idea.
I really have to give the lion's share of the credit to Florian Zeller for that, because I went to see when it was a play, The Father, I went to see it in Paris and was knocked out by it for the reasons you just outlined. And I went to find him and ask if I could translate the play. And then we became friends, and I've translated now 7 of his plays. But what was the unknown factor in The Father was that he decided he wanted to direct it. Well, you don't know whether, it's a kind of a chance on a first-time director always, but he turned out to be, not only had he created it and was the source of all the ideas in it, he also turned out to be a really, really good film director. And what I did was I was able to help with, because I'd done a lot of thinking about the difference between what works in the theatre and what works in film. We kept pretty close to the play, but it was really in the sort of interstices between the scenes that we were able to do things that were cinematic in a way that doesn't exist in the theatre. It was a very modest film. It was, it had a budget of $5 million and he had 25 days to shoot it.
25 days? That was it?
Yeah.
Gosh. Well, I guess you're just inside one apartment, aren't you, most of the time? Well, apart from the end, but still.
It was all those years further on, but it was the same budget that I got for Carrington and half the number of days. And so I was really impressed by, of course, it's a great help that Anthony Hopkins is absolutely charming and only gives you trouble on one thing, which is he doesn't like doing too many takes. So that keeps it moving.
Well, that's probably quite good under the circumstances. We've only got 25 days. I have to admit, Christopher, that when I knew I was interviewing you, I was pleased and excited. And I spoke to this friend of mine, Joe Spence, who's the headmaster at Dulwich. And he said, well, I've got a question for Christopher. He's a great thespian as well. And he said, how much can a translation or an adaptation feel like your own original work? Because when you work so hard on something, I would imagine it feels like it becomes your own.
No, it doesn't really. It's a technical thing, translating. And I found very early on, because they put me to it at the Royal Court, I had to do 2 or 3 plays while I was on the staff at the Royal Court. They just assigned them to me to translate. And I found I really enjoyed it. And it's a completely different exercise from writing your own plays, because it's an enormous number of tiny decisions. And it's like doing a kind of massive crossword puzzle or something. And you have to be very, very sensitive to what the effect of the play was in its original language, where the where the audience might have been expected to laugh, whether, it's a bit like going to the gym. I can do an hour on a translation in the morning and then the rest of the day on my own work. And it sort of loosens you up. And it's it's been an enormous contributory factor, I think, to my own work. It's a really important part of what I do. And after I'd done translated a lot of classics, I started to look out for contemporary writers that I might want to do. And so then I found Art, which was the first one by Yasmina Reza, and then Florian. And there's a German writer called Daniel Kehlmann, who I like very much. I've done a couple of his plays. So then you're actually in touch with the people, so you can discuss exactly what it is they meant here or there, or how best to. But it's not easy translating. And I think this was something that the Royal Court kind of invented around the time I went to work for them, because in the old days, when you did a Chekhov or an Ibsen or something, you would do the Penguin version or the Oxford Ronald Hingley or whatever. In other words, very good translations done by academics, not by playwrights. The Royal Court decided it would do all the Chekhov plays, and it would get a contemporary writer playwright to do each one. So they started with Angelico did The Seagull, and Edward Bond did Three Sisters, and then I did Uncle Vanya. And now it's a completely established practice. And in fact, every time a classic is done now at the National Theatre or wherever, they always get a brand new translation. They don't, so in a sense, there are no classic translations. I had a good period of 20 years where a lot of Ibsen productions, I think My Doll's House was on Broadway about 3 times, because people hadn't kind of cottoned on at that point, but now it's different.
You have Owen von Horbach, Chekhov, Ibsen, Yasmina Reza, you just mentioned, Florian Zeller, we've talked about. Of all of them, who has been the most satisfying to translate?
Well, you don't get any back talk from Chekhov.
No, that's true.
It's a double answer because Chekhov is my sort of god as a playwright, and I've loved doing the 3 plays of his that I've done and the productions that have ensued. Most recently The Seagull, which was done in the Royal Court's 50th anniversary, so it was lovely to go back in 2006. And it was a brilliant production by Ian Rickson with Kristen Scott Thomas, Airey Mulligan, who was then just emerging, and Chiwetel Ejiofor, and a sort of magical production. When you get a play that you love and you do a translation of it and it's then cast brilliantly, there's a very happy months that you spend doing that. But then, as I said just now, it's quite different if the relationship I've had with Yasmina Reza and recently, particularly with Florian, are very, they're also very rewarding in a different sort of way. And it's very exciting to introduce. I think Yasmina and Florian are both really important writers, and to introduce them to the English-speaking world is kind of a privilege.
In terms of your writing method, how do you construct your day?
It's sort of changed, because at the beginning I was quite puritanical about doing one thing at a time, and I would do that and then get it on, and you kind of, especially if you work in films and do translations, you can't really do that anymore. So at any given point, I'm probably working on 3 or 4 different things at different stages. And so that means a bit of organization. I try not to work on 2 different things in one day, and I use the morning to work on basically what I revise or have a look at what I did yesterday, and I really get weaving at about 2 o'clock in the afternoon as a rule, and work until drinks time.
Do you work in an office?
Well, I do have an office. I've used it less and less in recent years, because I have where I'm speaking to you from now is a house in Buckinghamshire, which I bought I suppose about 15, 16 years ago. And it's been great for my productivity, because I just get out of London. It's only an hour up the motorway, but it's very, very quiet. People don't ring you as a whole, and they don't bother you, and the work gets done much more stress-free in a way. London is full of temptations. There are things you want to see, there are exhibitions you want to go to, there are lunches you want to have with friends, and all those good things like get in the way.
Hard to say no. And do you write or type?
Oh, right. Handwritten. Always have. And then I get it typed by someone else, which means that a typescript arrives that has a sort of objective feel about it. It doesn't, you haven't kind of seen it before. And you read it in a different way. I think it may just be fantasy, but that's what I feel. So that's my routine, is to handwrite in black-bound big books, and then hand them to somebody else to type the first draft.
When you start writing, do the ideas come as you write, or do you have a plan and then put it on paper?
I feel I've got slightly less rigid in that respect as the years go by. I always used to work to a very detailed plan. I knew exactly what was going to happen at the end before I started, and so on. It was not always the case. Some plays kind of emerge weirdly, where you write one bit of the play first and then intersperse it with other bits. And, there are no rules really. But now I feel less, I feel more confident about embarking on something without knowing precisely how it's going to turn out. I think writers fall into two very distinct groups: those who like to set sail without knowing where they're going, and others who want fixed points along the journey. And I'm one of the latter.
You said you've written 60 screenplays and 20 have been made into films. Is there one in particular that you think, that really should see the light of day?
Yeah, I had a spell of, having spoken so much about good luck, I had a spell of bad luck in the 90s after the Oscar. And I did a series of studio films which for one reason or another were never made, and two of them in particular. One was an enormous film about the Vietnam War based on a book called A Bright Shining Lie by Neil Sheehan. That got quite far down the line with Warner Brothers, who had done Liaisons, so I had a kind of relationship with them. But then for some reason at the last minute wrote the script over a couple of years. I went to Vietnam, I did a lot of research. I worked with a young director called Phil Juan, who I liked very much, who just made a film called State of Grace with Gary Oldman. Then one of those things happened, which is the studio, Hollywood is like Versailles. You have no idea what the grown-ups are doing. All of a sudden they decided they would do it on HBO, and not, which clearly they couldn't. My script was in an enormous, big scale, sort of Lawrence of Arabia scale script, really. And they got a TV director in who threw out the script and rewrote it himself, and in 8 weeks. And the only merciful thing was I managed to take my name off it, because it was really poor, the result. But, that's the one that got away. I always think of it as the best script I ever wrote.
Is there any chance that it could, in the future, be resurrected?
It's there. In fact, Faber's, there was a time in the 80s and 90s when film scripts were regularly published. So Faber's did publish it, so it exists if anyone ever wants to do it. And then I did do a year with David Lean, and I adapted a novel by Conrad called Nostromo, which went again through many vicissitudes. But eventually, 2 or 3 months before he was due to shoot it, he died. So we did make serious attempts to resuscitate that with another director, but we never. Again, it was it was a huge epic, very expensive. So that never got made. But again, it exists. It was published.
So there's still hope.
You just have to. You never know. The thing is, you really never know. You don't have any idea what. That's why I often say that whereas being a playwright in the theatre is a relatively respectable profession, writing for the cinema is literally going into the casino. When it works, like, the films we've been talking about with Dangerous Liaison or Atonement or The Father, it's magical. It's absolutely wonderful. But it's so statistically so rare that kind of thing happens that you've just got to be super philosophical about it.
We haven't talked about Sunset Boulevard. That's a total departure from anything you'd done before. You're a lyricist. You wrote the novel for it. How did that happen?
Because I was at school with Tim Rice, I knew Tim and Andrew when we were all teenagers, I guess. Early on, they asked me to write the book for Jesus Christ Superstar. I remember going around and listening to it, the demo. And it was 2 hours. I said, it's 2 hours long. Where's the book going to go? Talked myself out of several million. But anyway, from time to time, I would see Andrew, and I had lunch with him in I think the early 80s, and he asked me if I would, if I would do. I was being interested in working on Phantom of the Opera. I said, let me think about it. And I went and read the book and everything. And I said, look, this is not really my cup of tea, so good luck with it and everything. But I said, I do think what would make a wonderful musical is Sunset Boulevard, because I'd always loved the film. And it seemed like an opera. And in fact, I had first approached the ENO to see if they could pair me up with a composer and I could do a proper, an opera. Andrew somehow got hold of the rights, and And then first of all, he asked me just to write the book. And I said, oh, no, I'd love to write the lyrics as well. And he said, well, I've asked Don Black to write the lyrics. I'd never met Don. He said, well, you better meet him. We better have lunch with him. And we got on so well immediately. He said, why don't we just sit in a room and do the whole thing together, which is what we did. I've now done a couple more musicals with Don.
Oh, have you? I didn't realise.
Yeah, well, we did another one with Andrew called Stephen Ward, which was about the Profumo.
Yes.
Studio. I did a Broadway musical based on Dracula, which has always been one of my favourite books.
Gosh, how fabulous.
Still touring in South Korea, I believe. We've just done a version of The Third Man, which is kind of still in development, which hopefully we can get on in the next year or two. The nice thing about it is being in a room with someone else and working together. I also had with Florian on the films that I've done with him. With Don, it's writing lyrics is really enjoyable. It turns out. I'm sure if you were on your own, you'd be tearing your hair out. But if there's two of you in a rhyming dictionary, and you've got a fair chance.
Is there anything that you're not so good at?
I would say just about everything else. No, I'm not terribly competent about the house or any of those things. And this has been reflected in our conversation, really. The saving decision was really to diversify as much as possible. I remember David Hare and I, we were both working at the Royal Court at the same time. We were both in our 20s. We'd sort of become aware that a playwright's lifespan in the theatre was not necessarily very long. And there were very good playwrights who, had 5 years or 10 years. And then disappeared. So we were trying to work out what the best thing to do was to try to maintain a long career. And so it was obviously something that preyed on our minds. And in my case, the answer was just try and do lots and lots of different things. And in David's case, he did a lot of directing, which was also something that kept he did a lot of directing of his own work as well as other people. So that was, another string. You need another string to the bow, I think.
Yes. Well, and aside from the Mr. Wilder and Me and some of the other things you've mentioned, is there anything else that you're working on at the moment?
We've just finished the next Florian Zeller film, which is called The Sun.
Oh, gosh. Okay. And when's that due to come out?
I mean, it's literally just come out of the editing room about 2 or 3 weeks ago. I haven't actually seen it completely finished. It'll probably open at, Toronto Festival or somewhere like that in September and come out before the end of the year. So that's exciting. It's with Hugh Jackman and Laura Dern and set in America, but shot mostly here. We couldn't resist writing a very small cameo role at the center of the film for Anthony Hopkins.
Oh, really? I was going to say maybe for you, because of course you were in Total Eclipse.
That was a caprice of Leonardo DiCaprio. Yeah, because when we first all gathered in Paris to do the table read, as it's called, we'd only cast, there were a couple of French actors. There was David Thewlis and there was Leonardo DiCaprio. And Agnieszka said to me, will you read all the other parts during the table read? So I did. And apparently after this read, Leonardo said to Agnieszka, you've got to have him for the judge. So that's what I wasn't very good, I don't think.
Well, I've just watched it and I thought you were excellent. I was delighted. I thought, oh, there you are. Oh, fantastic. Did it brilliantly. Yeah,
well, mostly complicated thing was that it was tracking shot. The camera, as you spoke, quite a longish speech, the camera came towards you on the right and you were aware of all the actors who were sitting at the table there, ducking face down on the table so that the camera could. And then I had to sort of slightly move my right shoulder so that the camera could go over it and out the window to catch David Thewlis, who at the beginning of the scene had been at the other end of the. So they rushed him outside the window. Well, all this was going on while I was
You're trying to deliver your lines.
My one big speech. So we did about 11 takes, and finally, technically, it was okay. And she said, "Fine, that'll do." I said, "No, I was better on take 8."
But they took take 11.
Yes, absolutely.
Oh, well, here we are. That's showbiz. Thank you so much, Christopher, for taking the time out today. You're obviously so incredibly busy, and I'd like to go on and on and on. I have so many other things I wanted to ask you about. Good luck with everything that you're working on. I'm looking forward to going to see The Sun at the end of the year. That's going to be top of my list. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you very much. I've enjoyed it. Thank you.
You've been listening to Bandwidth Conversations. Thanks to Anna B., Head of Marketing, to Matthew Passy and all at the Podcast Consultant, to Bagawire for the music, to the Money Maze podcast. Thank you for listening. Any feedback, please email me, katie@bandwidthconversations.com. Please sign up on our website, www.bandwidthconversations.com, so we can notify you about new podcast releases. We hope to see you again soon.